The afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the pristine white marble floor. In the VIP wing's waiting area, a man in a simple white shirt sat quietly, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea that had long gone cold. "Sir, visiting hours ended 20 minutes ago," a nurse gently approached, walking alongside a family member from room 312. He looked up, gazing deeply into the eyes of the woman beside the nurse, speaking slowly but with quiet certainty. "But I think I can help her." The nurse glanced between the two of them. Room 312, where a little girl hadn't spoken to anyone in 8 months, where even her own mother had begun to lose hope. Both of them stood in silence. "May I ask who you are?" The man stood up, leaving his cold tea on the glass table, someone who understands what it feels like when words disappear. Sarah Mitchell had built her pharmaceutical empire on the belief that every problem had a solution. Every disease had a cure waiting to be discovered. Every setback had a workaround. Every challenge could be conquered with enough resources and determination. But sitting in the sterile hallway of Boston Children's Hospital, surrounded by the most advanced medical equipment money could buy, she felt smaller than she had in 20 years. Her daughter Emma lay behind that heavy door, as unreachable as if she were on another planet. The accident had happened 8 months ago, a simple trip to the grocery store that ended with their car wrapped around an oak tree. Emma's spine had taken the worst of it, leaving her legs useless and her face scarred by shattered glass. But it was the silence that terrified Sarah most, not the doctor's grim prognoses or the endless rounds of failed treatments, but the way her daughter had simply stopped talking, stopped trying, stopped believing that tomorrow might be different from today. Sarah watched through the window as Michael, that was his name, she'd learned, sat beside Emma's bed, not saying a word. His 9-year-old son Jake sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching in a worn notebook with colored pencils that had seen better days. There was something different about this boy, something that made Sarah's chest tighten. He moved with the careful precision of someone much older, glancing up occasionally at Emma with eyes that held too much understanding for someone his age. When was the last time she'd seen a child draw, in actual silence, without the constant chatter that usually accompanied childhood artwork? Michael hadn't asked for payment, hadn't presented credentials, hadn't even explained his methods. He'd simply appeared 3 days ago with a business card that read Community Family Services and a request that seemed almost absurd in its simplicity. "Let me spend time with her," he'd said. "No therapy sessions, no structured activities, just presence." Sarah had agreed out of desperation more than hope. Every renowned specialist from Harvard to Johns Hopkins had tried their magic on Emma. What harm could one more failure do? But watching them now, Sarah felt the first stirring of something she'd almost forgotten. Emma's eyes were open, not just open, alert, following Jake's movements as he carefully selected each crayon, as if the choice between blue and purple held the weight of the world. It was the most engaged her daughter had been since the accident. What kind of magic did this quiet man and his silent boy possess that million-dollar treatments couldn't replicate? The first week passed in a rhythm Sarah hadn't expected. Michael and Jake arrived every afternoon at precisely 2:30, carrying the same worn backpack and a thermos that smelled like homemade soup. Michael would settle into the chair beside Emma's bed with a book, always something different, she noticed, while Jake claimed his spot on the floor with his art supplies. They never tried to force conversation or impose activities. They simply existed in Emma's space like gentle weather, predictable and non-threatening. Sarah found herself scheduling her own visits around theirs, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite name. She'd built her career on understanding cause and effect, on measuring inputs and outputs, but this defied every model she knew. There were no charts tracking Emma's progress, no structured goals or therapeutic milestones, just 3 people sharing silence in a way that felt more healing than anything the medical team had attempted. On Thursday of that first week, Sarah arrived to find Jake teaching Emma a wordless game involving colored pencils and geometric shapes. They communicated entirely through pointing and nodding, building elaborate patterns on paper that seemed to follow rules only they understood. "What are they playing?" Sarah asked Michael quietly. He looked up from his book. Something about child psychology, she noticed, and smiled with genuine warmth. I have no idea, he admitted. Jake invented it last year when he was working through some difficult emotions. He calls it picture talking. Says sometimes colors can say things that words can't reach. Michael's voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience. Emma seems to understand the rules instinctively. Children often do, when we stop trying to teach them and let them teach us instead. The first crack in Michael's armor came on Thursday afternoon. Sarah arrived early for her usual evening visit and found him in the family room, staring at a cup of coffee with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. His shoulders shook slightly, so briefly she almost missed it. When he noticed her presence, he straightened immediately, but not before she caught a glimpse of something raw and unguarded in his expression. "Rough day?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Michael's laugh held no humor. "Jake spoke today. First time in 2 years." He paused, swirling the cold coffee. He asked if Emma's mom loved her as much as his mom had loved him. The question hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Sarah felt her throat constrict. How did you explain to a 9-year-old that love and protection weren't the same thing? That sometimes loving someone meant watching them hurt and not being able to fix it? What did you tell him? She whispered. The truth, that sometimes love looks like sitting in the dark with someone who can't find the light. Michael's eyes met hers, and she saw her own exhaustion reflected there. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just stay. There was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't just talking about Emma and Jake. Something that made Sarah wonder what darkness he'd been sitting in, and for how long. That night, Sarah called her assistant and canceled her morning meetings. For the first time in months, she wanted to be somewhere other than her office when the sun came up. She wanted to watch Emma sleep, to memorize the way her daughter's face looked peaceful in the early morning light. She wanted to understand what Michael saw when he looked at her child with such patient acceptance. She arrived at the hospital before dawn, expecting to find Emma's room empty except for the sleeping figure in the narrow bed. Instead, she discovered Michael already there, sitting in the chair beside Emma's bed with Jake curled up asleep in his lap. Neither of them stirred when she entered, but Michael's eyes opened and met hers across the dim room. They didn't speak. There was something about the pre-dawn quiet that made words feel unnecessary. "Bad night?" Sarah whispered finally. Jake had nightmares. Sometimes being in the hospital triggers memories. Michael's voice was barely audible, careful not to wake either child. Emma heard him crying through the wall and asked the night nurse if we could stay. Said she understood about bad dreams. He paused, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. "She's been talking to Jake, you know. Not much, just a few words here and there. But she's trying to comfort him the same way he's been helping her." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even realized was tight. Emma was talking. Not to the doctors or therapists or even to her, but to a 9-year-old boy who understood that sometimes silence was its own language. "What does she say to him?" Sarah asked, settling into the visitor's chair as quietly as possible. Yesterday she told him that his mom would be proud of how brave he's being, that helping other people heal is what love looks like when someone can't be there anymore. Michael's voice caught slightly. Then she asked him to teach her how to draw birds. Said she wanted to learn how to make something beautiful even when she felt broken. The breakthrough happened on a Tuesday, during the kind of autumn rainstorm that turned the world gray and made everyone want to hibernate. Sarah had been delayed in meetings all morning, fielding calls from investors who wanted to know why she'd been so distracted lately. When she finally reached the hospital, she found Michael in the hallway, his face pale as paper. "What happened?" she demanded, her heart already racing. "Emma spoke," he said quietly. "She asked Jake why he doesn't talk about his mother." Sarah's breath caught. "And?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, looking older than his 38 years. "Jake told her that talking about someone you've lost makes them feel further away. That silence keeps them close." He paused, and Sarah noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Emma said she understood, that she'd been keeping herself close the same way. Sarah sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. In all the months of therapy and treatment, no one had thought to ask Emma why she'd chosen silence. They'd assumed it was trauma, depression, a natural response to catastrophic loss. But what if it had been something else entirely? What if it had been love? The fierce, protective kind that holds tight to what remains when everything else has been taken away. But the real revelation came later that evening, when Sarah returned to find Emma and Jake sitting together on the hospital bed, looking through a photo album that Sarah recognized with a jolt of surprise. It was Emma's baby book, the one Sarah had brought weeks ago and left forgotten on the bedside table. "Mom," Emma said when she noticed Sarah in the doorway, "Jake was showing me pictures of his mom. She looked really nice." Emma's voice was soft but clear, the first full sentence she'd spoken in Sarah's presence since the accident. "She was," Jake agreed, pointing to a picture Emma held. "She had a really good laugh, like yours, but louder." He paused, then added with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes emerged from children, "Dad says people don't really leave us, they just love us from a different place." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense in a way that adult reassurances had not. Sarah watched her daughter trace the edges of the photograph with careful fingers and realized that Emma wasn't just learning to speak again, she was learning to remember joy without fear, to hold love and loss in the same small hands without being crushed by the weight of both. When had her 11-year-old daughter become wise enough to understand that healing meant integration rather than forgetting? The question that haunted Sarah most came to her at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling of her empty house. How had this stranger, this man who worked at a community center and drove a 15-year-old Honda, understood her daughter better in 1 week than she had in 8 months? What did that say about her as a mother, as a person? She'd spent so much energy trying to fix Emma that she'd forgotten to simply be with her. The next morning brought unexpected insight in the form of Dr. Patricia Chen, Emma's primary therapist, who requested a private meeting with Sarah. "I've been observing Emma's interactions with the Thompson family," Dr. Chen began, settling into her office chair with the careful precision of someone about to deliver complex news. "I want to discuss what we're seeing." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, preparing for criticism or concerns about the unorthodox arrangement. "Emma's showing remarkable progress in areas we hadn't expected," Dr. Chen continued. "Her willingness to engage, her emotional regulation, even her physical responses during therapy sessions have improved dramatically. But more importantly, she's demonstrating what we call post-traumatic growth, the development of strengths and insights that emerge from working through significant challenges." The doctor paused, choosing her words carefully. "Whatever Mr. Thompson is doing, it's working in ways that traditional therapy hasn't been able to achieve." Sarah leaned forward, hungry for understanding. What exactly is he doing differently? Dr. Chen smiled, the expression of someone about to share a professional insight that had taken years to develop. "He's not trying to fix her, Mrs. Mitchell. He's not approaching Emma as a problem to be solved or a deficit to be corrected. He's simply creating space for her to discover her own resilience." The explanation felt both simple and revolutionary, like learning that the answer to a complex equation had been hiding in plain sight. 3 weeks into Michael's visits, Sarah began to notice changes that couldn't be measured on any medical chart. Emma started making eye contact during their brief conversations. She began eating without being reminded. Most remarkably, she'd started drawing. Tentative sketches at first, then more confident strokes that gradually filled entire pages. The drawings were always the same subject, birds, but these weren't the soaring eagles or graceful swans that might be expected. Emma drew birds with broken wings, birds sitting quietly in trees, birds that seemed content to simply exist without needing to fly. Jake's drawings evolved too, though more subtly. His constant black and gray palette slowly incorporated other colors, muted blues, soft greens, the occasional touch of yellow. Sarah found herself looking forward to seeing what new shade would appear, like watching a sunset in reverse. The boys didn't talk much during their sessions, but they communicated in ways that bypassed language entirely. A shared glance, a silent nod, the careful way Jake positioned his crayon box so Emma could reach it easily. But it was during one of these quiet drawing sessions that Sarah witnessed something that changed her understanding of what healing could look like. Emma had been working on a particularly detailed bird when her pencil slipped, creating an unintended mark across the wing. Sarah watched, expecting frustration or the urge to start over that had characterized Emma's pre-accident perfectionism. Instead, Emma studied the mistake for a long moment, then began incorporating it into the design, turning the accidental line into part of the bird's feather pattern. "Sometimes mistakes make things more interesting," Emma said quietly, not looking up from her drawing. "Jake taught me that. He says his mom used to tell him that the best quilts always had at least one wrong stitch, because that's what made them real instead of perfect." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, recognizing the profound shift this represented. Emma was learning to work with imperfection rather than against it, to find beauty in the unplanned and uncontrolled. The crisis came without warning, as these things always do. Sarah arrived at the hospital to find Emma's room empty and Michael nowhere to be found. Panic shot through her chest like electricity. "Where is she?" she demanded of the first nurse she encountered. "Where's my daughter?" The nurse's face was carefully neutral, the expression medical professionals wear when delivering news no parent wants to hear. "Mrs. Mitchell." Emma had an episode this morning. She became very agitated, started pulling at her IV lines. She kept saying she wanted to go home, that she was tired of pretending to get better. The nurse paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Thompson took her to the roof garden. They've been up there for 2 hours." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The roof garden was 4 stories up, accessible only through a secured door. What was Michael thinking? She found them sitting on a bench surrounded by late-blooming chrysanthemums. Jake on one side of Emma, Michael on the other. None of them were talking. Emma's face was tear-streaked but calm, her hands folded in her lap with unusual stillness. "I told them I don't want to be broken anymore," Emma said without looking up. "But I don't know how to be whole either." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs weak. Michael's response was so quiet Sarah had to strain to hear it. "Being broken isn't the opposite of being whole, Emma. Sometimes broken things heal stronger than they were before. Sometimes the cracks are where the light gets in." He paused, and Sarah noticed he was looking at his son as much as her daughter. "And sometimes healing means learning to love the parts of yourself that don't work the way they used to." Jake, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly reached into his backpack and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "I made this for you," he said to Emma, his voice steadier than Sarah had heard it in weeks. "For when you feel like giving up." Emma unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a small clay bird that Jake had obviously crafted himself. It was imperfect, side-sided and painted in colors that didn't quite match. But there was something beautiful about its asymmetry. "It's not supposed to fly," Jake explained. "It's supposed to be happy sitting still. Dad helped me make it in art therapy. He said sometimes the most important thing isn't what you can do, but who you are when you're not doing anything at all." Emma held the clay bird against her chest, and Sarah saw something shift in her daughter's expression. A kind of acceptance that went deeper than resignation, a peace that encompassed rather than denied her limitation. That night, Sarah lay awake, thinking about cracks and light, about the difference between being fixed and being whole. She thought about Emma's drawings of flightless birds, about Jake's slow emergence from his fortress of silence, about Michael's inexplicable understanding of pain that couldn't be cured with money or expertise. She thought about her own cracks, the marriage that had crumbled under the weight of success, the relationships she'd sacrificed for career advancement, the way she'd learned to equate love with providing rather than simply being present. But mostly, she thought about the clay bird now sitting on Emma's nightstand, and the way her daughter had smiled when Jake explained that some things were meant to find their beauty in stillness rather than motion. There was a lesson there that Sarah was only beginning to understand. Something about the difference between healing and returning to a previous state. Something about the courage required to embrace a new version of wholeness rather than mourning what had been lost. The next morning brought an unexpected conversation that would reshape Sarah's understanding of everything that had transpired. She found Michael in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a journal filled with careful handwriting. "May I join you?" she asked, and he gestured to the empty chair across from him with the quiet courtesy that characterized all his interactions. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Sarah began, then paused, unsure how to articulate the questions that had kept her awake. "About broken things healing stronger. How do you know when healing is happening versus when someone is just adapting to being broken?" Michael looked up from his journal, and she saw something in his expression that suggested he'd been waiting for this conversation. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said quietly. "The difference between acceptance and resignation, between growth and survival." He closed the journal, but kept his hand resting on its cover. "Jake and I learned the difference the hard way. For the first year after Lisa died, we were surviving, going through motions, pretending to be okay, waiting for things to go back to normal." He paused, and Sarah saw the shadow of old pain cross his features. "What changed?" she asked. "Jake drew a picture of our family, but he only drew 2 people. When I asked him where his mom was, he said she wasn't in the picture because the picture was about now, not before." Michael's voice grew softer. "That's when I realized we weren't healing. We were just refusing to acknowledge reality. Healing meant learning to draw new pictures that included who we'd become after loss, not trying to recreate the old ones." The revelation came gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape you thought you knew. Emma wasn't getting better because Michael was fixing her. She was getting better because he was teaching her, teaching them all, that broken didn't mean worthless, that silence could be healing instead of hiding, that sometimes the most profound help came not from trying to solve someone's problems, but from sitting with them in the spaces where solutions didn't exist. Michael never explained his methods, because they weren't really methods at all. They were simply the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd learned to find grace in the aftermath of loss. Someone who understood that healing wasn't about returning to who you were before, but about discovering who you could become after everything familiar had been stripped away. 2 months after that first afternoon encounter, Sarah found herself in the hospital family room again, but this time the atmosphere was different. Emma sat propped against pillows, her latest drawing spread across the bedside table. It was still a bird, but this one had its wings spread wide, not in flight, but in a gesture that looked like an embrace. "I want to try the surgery," Emma announced, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been since before the accident. Sarah's breath caught. They'd discussed the experimental procedure weeks ago, a complex operation that might restore some feeling to Emma's legs, though the chances were uncertain at best. Emma had refused even to consider it then, too afraid of hoping for something that might not happen. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, moving closer to the bed. Emma nodded, then looked directly at Michael. "You said broken things can heal stronger. I want to find out what that means." She paused, then added with a small smile. "Besides, Jake drew me a picture of myself walking. I should probably try to make it come true." The 9-year-old boy ducked his head, embarrassed by the attention, but Sarah caught the pleased expression that flickered across his features. Michael's face showed something Sarah had never seen there before, a kind of quiet pride mixed with relief, as if he'd been holding his breath for months and could finally exhale. "The surgery's scheduled for next Tuesday," Sarah said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Will you—" She paused, unsure how to ask what she really wanted to know. Would he stay? Would he see this through? Would he be there when Emma woke up, scared and hoping and needing someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to try anyway? "We'll be here," Michael said simply, and Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even realized was tight. The morning of Emma's surgery arrived gray and cold, the kind of November day that made spring feel like a fairy tale. Sarah had barely slept, her mind cycling through worst-case scenarios and half-formed prayers to a God she hadn't spoken to since her own childhood. She found Michael in the waiting room before dawn, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking as tired as she felt. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, accepting the offered cup gratefully. "Jake was up most of the night drawing," Michael admitted. "I think he's more nervous than he's letting on." He gestured toward the boy, who sat curled in an oversized chair with his sketch pad, working with the intense concentration of someone trying to solve a problem through art. "He keeps drawing the same picture over and over." Emma standing up, walking toward something he won't let me see. They sat in comfortable silence as the hospital came to life around them. Nurses changing shifts, doctors making early rounds, families beginning their own journeys through hope and fear and the strange liminal space where medicine meets miracles. Sarah found herself thinking about all the mornings she'd spent in conference rooms instead of moments like this, all the conversations she'd missed while building an empire that suddenly felt less important than this quiet vigil. The waiting stretched on for hours, marked by small rituals that became anchors in the uncertainty. Michael reading quietly from a book of poetry, Jake adding careful details to his mysterious drawing, Sarah making and remaking phone calls to postpone meetings that had seemed crucial yesterday but felt trivial now. They took turns getting food none of them wanted, shared updates with family members who seemed impossibly distant, and measured time in the rhythm of Emma's heartbeat on the monitor they could hear faintly through the surgical suite doors. "Michael?" Sarah said suddenly, the question that had been forming for weeks finally finding its voice. "What happened to Jake's mother?" She saw him stiffen slightly, saw the careful way he set down his coffee cup. "You don't have to tell me. I keep wondering how you learned to do this, to help people heal." She paused, then added more quietly, "to help me learn how to be present for my own daughter." Michael was quiet for so long, Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Car accident. 3 years ago. Lisa was coming home from her night shift at the hospital. She was a pediatric nurse." He glanced toward Jake, who was still absorbed in his drawing. Jake was in the car. He saw everything. The doctors said there was nothing physically wrong with his voice, but he just stopped talking, stopped believing that words could make anything better. Sarah felt her throat close, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "And you, how did you cope?" Michael's smile was sad but genuine. "I didn't, at first. I spent 2 years trying to fix him, trying to bring back the chattering, laughing boy he'd been before. Took him to specialists, tried every therapy, even considered medication." He shook his head. "It wasn't until I stopped trying to make him the same and started learning who he was becoming that we both began to heal." The parallel hit Sarah like a revelation. She'd been doing the same thing with Emma, trying to restore her to some previous version of herself instead of accepting the person her daughter was becoming, trying to erase the accident instead of learning to live with its consequences. "Is that what you've been teaching me?" she asked. "To love who Emma is now, instead of mourning who she was before?" "I think," Michael said carefully, "you've been teaching yourself. I just provided some quiet space for you to figure it out." He met her eyes, and Sarah saw something there that looked like respect. "Being present isn't something you learn from a book, Sarah. It's something you practice, one moment at a time, until it becomes as natural as breathing." The surgeon emerged from the operating room at 2:30 that afternoon, her scrub still damp with the evidence of hours spent working miracles with titanium and determination. "The procedure went better than expected," Dr. Rodriguez announced, and Sarah felt her knees buckle with relief. "We were able to repair more of the nerve damage than we initially thought possible. Emma's going to need months of physical therapy, and we can't make any promises about how much function she'll ultimately regain, but, Michael prompted gently, one hand steady on Sarah's shoulder. "But there's real reason for hope. The response we're seeing in the lower extremities is encouraging. With time and hard work, there's a good chance Emma will walk again." The surgeon paused, then added with a small smile, "She's asking for someone named Jake. Says he promised to show her a picture when she woke up." 3 hours later, Emma was alert enough for visitors, though still groggy from anesthesia. Jake approached her bed with the careful solemnity of someone carrying precious cargo, his latest drawing clutched against his chest. "I made this for you," he said, his voice stronger than Sarah had heard it since that first day. It's what I see when I think about you getting better. Emma accepted the paper with hands that shook slightly from medication and emotion. The drawing showed two figures, a girl and a boy, standing at the edge of what looked like a garden. But it wasn't the standing that caught Sarah's attention. It was the way Jake had drawn them reaching toward each other. The girl's hand extended in invitation, the boy's outstretched in response. At the bottom of the page, in careful block letters, Jake had written, "Friends help each other remember how to be brave." "It's perfect," Emma whispered, and Sarah saw tears gathering in her daughter's eyes. "Will you help me learn to walk again? When I'm ready?" Jake nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by reaching out and taking Emma's hand. It was the first time Sarah had seen him initiate physical contact with anyone except his father. "We'll figure it out together," Jake said. "Dad says that's how the best adventures work anyway." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the doorway of Emma's room, watching her daughter take careful steps across the hardwood floor. The physical therapy had been grueling, the progress measured in inches rather than miles, but Emma had approached each session with a determination that reminded Sarah of herself at her most focused. The difference was that Emma's focus came from a place of acceptance rather than desperation, growth rather than grasping. Michael and Jake had become regular fixtures in their lives, though not in any way Sarah had expected. There were no grand gestures or dramatic declarations, just a quiet integration of presence and support that felt as natural as breathing. Michael had never asked for payment, had never tried to formalize his role in Emma's recovery. He simply continued to show up, continued to offer the gift of patient witnessing that had started Emma's healing journey. The transformation hadn't been limited to Emma. Sarah found herself approaching her work differently, building time for presence into schedules that had previously been ruled by efficiency and output. She'd started eating lunch away from her desk, taking walks during conference calls, and, most significantly, arriving home in time for dinner more often than not. The pharmaceutical empire still demanded her attention, but it no longer consumed her identity. "Mom, watch this!" Emma called out, then took 5 unassisted steps across the room before settling into her wheelchair with a grin of triumph. "Jake says by summer I might be able to walk all the way to the garden behind his house. He's planning to teach me how to plant tomatoes." The casual way she spoke about the future, as if it were a given rather than a hope, filled Sarah with a gratitude so profound it bordered on prayer. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," Sarah replied, meaning it more than Emma could possibly know. She looked out the window toward the setting sun, thinking about gardens and growth, about the strange alchemy that transforms broken places into fertile ground for new beginnings. In the distance, she could see Michael and Jake on the front lawn, Jake demonstrating some complicated soccer move while his father watched with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that the smallest moments often contained the greatest gifts. The evening routine had evolved over the months into something Sarah treasured: dinner together, followed by what they'd come to call quiet time, an hour when Emma practiced her physical therapy exercises while Jake drew at the kitchen table, and the adults shared the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to communicate as much through presence as through words. Tonight, as spring rain tapped against the windows, Sarah watched her daughter work through her stretching routine with the methodical determination that had characterized her approach to healing. "I've been thinking," Emma said during a particularly challenging balance exercise, "about what I want to be when I grow up." She paused, concentrating on maintaining her position. "I think I want to help other kids who've been in accidents. Not as a doctor, but like what Michael does. Just being there so they don't feel so alone." Sarah felt her throat tighten with pride and something deeper, recognition that her daughter had found purpose in her pain, meaning in her recovery. Jake looked up from his drawing, considering Emma's words with the seriousness he brought to all important conversations. "That would be really good," he said finally. "You understand what it feels like to be scared and not know if things will ever be okay again. That's important." He returned to his artwork, adding careful details to what appeared to be a portrait of his mother. "Dad says the best helpers are people who've needed help themselves." Sarah had never found out exactly what made Michael qualified to help her daughter heal. She'd never asked to see credentials or certificates. never demanded explanations for methods that couldn't be quantified or replicated. What she'd discovered instead was something more valuable than expertise: the recognition that sometimes the most profound help came from people who'd learned to find hope in the aftermath of loss, who'd discovered that healing was less about fixing what was broken and more about learning to love what remained. The last drawing in Emma's collection, the one she kept on her nightstand and looked at every morning, showed two families walking together down a path lined with trees. The figures were simple, almost childlike in their execution, but there was something in the way Jake had drawn them that suggested movement toward rather than away from something. At the top of the page, in Emma's careful handwriting, were the words, "Sometimes the best help comes from people who understand that being broken doesn't mean being less than whole." As autumn deepened into winter and Emma's steps grew steadier, Sarah found herself thinking often about that first afternoon when Michael had appeared in their lives like an answer to a prayer. She hadn't known how to pray. She thought about the courage it must have taken for him to offer help when his own healing was still in progress, about the wisdom hidden in his simple presence, about the way love sometimes looked like sitting quietly with someone in their darkness until they remembered they carried their own light. In the end, Michael had been right about broken things healing stronger. But the strength hadn't come from returning to what they'd been before. It had come from learning to embrace what they were becoming. A family expanded by loss and found again through the patient work of witnesses who understood that the most powerful healing happened not in the bright lights of operating rooms, but in the quiet spaces where people chose to stay present with each other, one breath at a time, until hope became as natural as heartbeat, and wholeness revealed itself to be not the absence of cracks, but the way light learned to shine through them.